There is a kind of exhaustion that does not show up on your face. It does not make you pale or slow your words or cause anyone in the room to look twice. It lives in your legs. It settles into the space behind your knees and works its way down through your calves until standing becomes something you have to think about, something you have to negotiate with your own body 1 minute at a time. I know that exhaustion the way you know a scar you have carried so long, you forget it is there until someone touches it. I am standing in my kitchen right now, the one I chose in the house. I chose in the life I built with my own hands after everything that came before. The coffee in my mug is hot. The window above the sink looks out onto a yard where nothing is expected of me before sunrise. My hands are steady. They have been steady for a long time now. But I want to take you back to when they were not. I want to take you back to a farmhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1984. To a kitchen that was not mine to a week, that nearly took something from me I would not have known how to name at the time. I was 19 years old. I was 7 days into my marriage, and I was gripping the edge of a kitchen table with both hands just to stay upright, surrounded by people who did not see anything wrong with that picture at all. By the end of this story, you are going to understand exactly why no one asked if I was all right. And you are going to understand what finally made me speak, and what I found when I did, and why the answer came from the last place I ever would have looked. Before I take you there, I want to ask you something. Have you ever done your absolute best in a situation where no one around you even noticed? Not because they were cruel, just because it never occurred to them to look. Type yes in the comments if you know that feeling, because I think what I am about to share is going to land closer to home than you expect. There is one more thing I need to tell you before we go back to that kitchen. A year after my wedding, I found something hidden beneath the floorboards of that house. Something that had been sealed away for 31 years. And when I understood what it was and who had put it there, it changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I had believed was my enemy. That discovery is coming. But you need to understand the week that came first, or none of it will mean what it is supposed to mean. Let us go back to the beginning. I was 19 years old when I married Thaddeus Aldercott. In our community, that was not considered young. Some girls in Harrow Creek had married at 17. We were plain folk, a close-order community in the rolling farmland of Lancaster County, and the shape of a woman's life was considered settled long before she was old enough to have much of an opinion about it. I had known Thaddeus for less than a year before the wedding, and knowing him meant something different in our world than it might mean in yours. It meant 4 supervised visits in total, each one lasting no more than 2 hours, always in the presence of family. It meant a handful of letters passed between us through his younger sister, Arvilla, whom everyone called Villa, a bright and quietly watchful girl of 15 who seemed to find the whole arrangement more interesting than either of us did. And it meant one long ride home in a buggy after a Sunday singing a night in early spring, when the fields smelled like turned earth and cold air, during which Thaddeus and I spoke fewer than 10 sentences of any real consequence to each other. Our marriage was not arranged in the way that word makes people imagine, with parents studying ledgers and shaking hands over their children like livestock at a county fair. It was softer than that and more invisible. It was a quiet nod between families, a recognition that the pieces fit. Thaddeus was 24, responsible, the eldest son of a family whose name meant something in Harrow Creek. He needed a wife to run his household. I was 19, and there was simply no other path anyone had ever shown me. That was the whole of the calculation. I do not say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it is true, and because the truth of it is important to everything that follows. The wedding itself was held on a bright, cold Saturday in October. There were long tables of food that had been prepared over 3 days by dozens of women in the community, pies and roasted meats and pickled vegetables and breads, whose crusts caught the light like something golden and perfect. There were hymns sung slowly in the old German voices, rising and blending in the plain wooden room until the sound became something you could feel in your chest. And there was Reverend Whitfield, 68 years old, with the kind of voice that made every sentence sound like a verdict being handed down. He stood at the front of the room and read from Scripture about submission and duty and the sacred ordering of the household, and his words fell over me like something being measured and fitted. I wore a new dress in dark blue, a white cape and apron pinned tightly across my chest. My hands were cold from the moment I walked into that room. I held them together in my lap through the entire ceremony to keep anyone from seeing that they would not stop trembling. I remember a single clear thought passing through me during the reading. I thought, this is the last day I will ever just be myself. After today, I am someone's wife. And I had no idea standing there with cold hands and a pinned apron and a room full of people watching me become a role how precisely and literally true that was going to be. It was Reverend Whitfield who made it concrete in the way that only certain men can make things concrete without raising their voice or showing their teeth. The ceremony had ended. People were moving toward the food tables, the low sound of conversation filling the room. I had not yet eaten a thing. I had not yet spoken to Thaddeus as his wife, not outside the formal words of the service. And Reverend Whitfield appeared at my elbow with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He guided me gently but with purpose to a corner of the room where we were near enough to the gathering to be seen, but far enough that our words stayed between us. He smiled. It was a warm smile, the kind that had probably reassured a great many people over a great many decades. He said the Aldercott family has been the foundation of this community for 3 generations. Thaddeus is a good man who deserves a wife who understands her place within this household and within Harrow Creek. I am confident you will not disappoint us. He said it the way a man says something he considers to be encouragement, as though he were telling me I had been given a wonderful opportunity and he simply wanted to make sure I understood the terms. I said, "Thank you, Reverend," I smiled back. But standing there with the October light coming through the plain windows and the smell of roasted meat in the air, and my hands still cold inside my gloves, I understood something that I did not yet have the language for. This marriage was not between 2 people. It was between me and a whole architecture of expectation. And Reverend Whitfield had just handed me the blueprint. I looked across the room and my eyes found a woman I did not yet know well. Her name was Beulah Storch, 55 years old, a neighbor who had been close to Thaddeus's mother Opal for as long as anyone in Harrow Creek could remember. Beulah was watching me from across the food table with an expression that I would spend the next several months learning to read. It was not unfriendly exactly. It was the look of someone assessing the durability of a new piece of equipment, appraising whether it would hold up under regular use. I did not understand that look yet. I would. And somewhere beneath both of those moments, beneath Reverend Whitfield's quiet contract and Beulah Storch's measuring gaze, there was a smaller thing I could not quite reach. The night before the wedding, my own mother had taken my hands in hers in the dim kitchen of my parents' house and said something I had not known how to hold on to at the time. She said, "Do not try to become Opal. Opal already tried that." I had thought she meant it as a compliment. Opal Aldercott was by every outward measure a woman who had built exactly the life that Harrow Creek valued. Her household ran without visible effort. Her reputation was without blemish. I had thought my mother was telling me that Opal was the model and that I might aspire to her. Standing in the corner with Reverend Whitfield's voice still in my ears, I felt the faintest edge of something different beneath those words. Not a compliment. Something else. Something I would not understand for a long time yet. But that came later. First came the morning after the wedding, and the morning after the wedding was where everything truly began. The house Thaddeus and I moved into was a small structure on the edge of the Aldercott family property, 50 yards down a rutted path from the main house where his parents lived. It was not really ours. In our community, most things belonged to the family in a way that made individual ownership feel like a kind of pride, which was itself considered a kind of sin. The house had been used by Thaddeus's uncle before us. It had his smell and his arrangement and his history in every room, and I was expected to make it mine without changing it in any way that would draw attention. I woke before 4 on the first morning, not because I had slept and then woken, because I had not slept at all. I stood in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, in a house I did not know yet, trying to find where the flour was kept, trying to understand how the wood stove worked, trying to hold myself together in the specific way that does not show on the outside. The stove was an older model than the one in my parents' house, and it ran differently, and I fed it twice as much wood as it needed before I understood that. And the kitchen got too hot before the sun had even begun to come up. I was supposed to have breakfast ready for Thaddeus and for his parents who lived up the path and came down most mornings, and for his 2 younger brothers who worked the farm alongside him. 8 people, 3 meals a day, starting before the sky turned light. Opal Aldercott came in without knocking. She did not announce herself. She simply appeared in the kitchen doorway in the thin early dark, already dressed, her gray hair pinned precisely, and she looked at the stove, and then she looked at me. She said, "You will learn." That was it. That was the whole of it. No warmth and no cruelty, just an assessment and a prediction. She had delivered her verdict on my performance before the sun was up on my first morning as a wife, and she had done it in 4 words that left me no room to ask a single question. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She did not respond. She turned and went back up the path to the main house. I stood in the hot kitchen with flour on my hands and sweat already starting at the back of my neck, and something cracking open slowly in my chest that I would spend the next several years learning how to close, and then learning much later that I had been closing the wrong thing. There was one more person in that kitchen that first morning who I have not mentioned yet because I am still working up to her. Beulah Storch arrived perhaps an hour after Opal carrying a covered dish, and the explanation that she had leftover butter from the previous day and did not want it to go to waste. She came in through the side door as though she had been doing so for years, which she had, and she set the dish on the counter and looked at the stove, and then she looked at me. She said in a voice like sugar poured slowly over gravel, "They did not teach you to start a proper fire where you came from." She was not angry. She was not even particularly unkind. She was simply noting a deficiency the way you might note a crack in a piece of crockery before deciding whether it was worth keeping. Opal was not in the room. Thaddeus was already outside. I was alone in that kitchen with Beulah Storch and her leftover butter and her assessment of my fire-starting abilities, and I smiled and said I was still learning the stove, and thank you so much for the butter. That morning I learned something that no one in Harrow Creek would have said aloud because it did not need to be said aloud. In that kitchen, there was more than one person keeping score. The first day unfolded the way I imagine the first days of wars unfold for the people who have no say in starting them. You simply move from one thing to the next because there is nothing else available to you. I cooked 3 meals for 8 people. I washed every dish by hand in water that was cold before I was halfway through the pile. I hung 2 loads of laundry on the lines behind the house, learning as I went which direction the wind came from and which sections of line would hold the heaviest pieces. I milked 2 cows that I had never milked before, learning that from Thaddeus's brother in a 15-minute demonstration that was thorough in exactly the way a manual is thorough. Technically complete and completely without feeling. And then in the late afternoon, the relatives came. There were 11 of them in total. Aunts and cousins and family friends and community members who had known the Aldercotts for decades, and they moved through our small house with the ease of people who belonged there more than I did. They touched the edges of our plates. They commented on how the bed covers were folded. They asked one after another variations of the same questions. Did I know how to put up vegetables for winter? Did I know how to cut a proper shirt pattern? Did I understand how to manage a household account? And through every one of those questions, I smiled and I said yes, or I said I am still learning, and I said thank you for asking. I did not say a single word in my own defense, not because I had nothing to say, because I had already absorbed in less than 14 hours of marriage that there was no space in that house for a woman's defense of herself. There was one exception. Among those 11 relatives, there was a woman named Serafina Calloway, 72 years old, who was Thaddeus's mother's sister by marriage. She was a small, precise woman with bright dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to observe more than they speak. She stood slightly to the side of the group as they moved through the kitchen, and she did not touch anything or comment on anything. She asked me one question. She said, "What is your favorite thing to eat?" I stood there and I looked at her, and I genuinely did not know how to answer. Not because I had no preference, but because no one had asked me a question about my own preferences in so many hours that the shape of the question surprised me like a hand extended in a room where I had expected none. Before I could find the words, Opal had already moved the group's attention elsewhere, steering the conversation with the ease of someone who had been managing the movement of rooms for decades. But Serafina Calloway looked at me in the moment before she turned away, and she did something so small I almost missed it. The faintest suggestion of a nod. Not acknowledgement of anything that had been said. Acknowledgement of what had just been avoided. I did not know yet why Serafina had left Harrow Creek 20 years earlier, or why the Aldercott family had not invited her to a single wedding or baptism in all the years since. I did not yet know what she had been looking for in the eyes of every new bride who married into this family. But I felt something pass between us in that kitchen that I could not name and did not forget. By the 3rd day, my body started to tell the truth even when I would not. My hands shook while I kneaded the dough for the morning bread, a fine, unsteady tremor that I could control if I focused, but that came back the moment my attention moved to something else. When I stood up too quickly from kneeling at the garden bed, My vision went gray at the edges for 3 or 4 seconds, a kind of dissolving that cleared slowly like fog burning off water. My lower back had seized up somewhere in the middle of the second day and had not released since. A low, constant burning that changed character depending on whether I was bending or standing or carrying. And my legs. My legs were the most honest part of me by day 3. By afternoon, they simply would not hold me steady without negotiation. I gripped the edge of counters. I used door frames. I pressed one hand against the wall when I walked from one room to another and hoped that whoever was watching would think I was reaching for something rather than holding myself up. On the third morning, tucked inside the pocket of one of Thaddeus's work shirts that I pulled from the laundry pile, I found a folded piece of paper. The handwriting on the outside of the fold was Opal's. I recognized it from the household inventory she had showed me the first morning, the list of what was stored and where and how much was left. I did not open it. It was not mine to open. I folded it back exactly as I had found it and put it back in his pocket and continued with the washing. But here is the thing that the paper told me without being opened. Opal was in communication with her son about the running of this household, about decisions and schedules and the management of things, and that communication was happening around me rather than through me. I was the person performing the labor. I was not the person being consulted about it. In the organizational structure of my own marriage, I had not yet been assigned a seat at the table. I wrung out a shirt and hung it on the line, and the wind took it sideways, and I straightened it and moved to the next one. What else was there to do? The moment that broke something open inside me happened on the 4th afternoon. I was standing at the stove stirring a pot of beef stew for the evening meal. The kitchen smelled like browned onions in the particular warmth of a wood stove that has been burning all day. My legs had been unreliable since mid-morning, and I had been managing them by keeping one hand on the counter and shifting my weight every few minutes. And then they simply gave out. Not dramatically. I did not fall to the floor. But I stumbled hard to the left, hard enough that my hip caught the edge of a chair and sent it skidding sideways across the floor, with a sound that rang through the small house like a declaration. The sound brought Thaddeus in from outside. He came through the back door with the quick alertness of someone who has heard something break, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at me, and he looked at the chair lying on its side on the floor. I stood very still with my hand on the counter and my heart doing something irregular and painful in my chest. And I thought, this is it. Someone is finally going to ask. Thaddeus crossed the room. He picked up the chair. He set it back on its legs with a small, precise adjustment so that it sat squarely. He said, careful now. And then he sat down at the table and waited for his stew. I turned back to the pot. I stirred. The stew moved in slow circles. The smell of onions was very strong. I want to stop here and ask you something directly because I think this question matters more than almost anything else in this story. Do you think that staying silent about pain actually protects the people around you? Or does it just protect the system that is causing the pain in the first place? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Because the answer to that question is the difference between what happened to Opal and what happened to me. That night after the house was dark and Thaddeus's breathing had steadied into sleep, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling of a room that still smelled like someone else's life. I cried without making a sound. I had learned to do this when I was very small in the way that children in certain houses learn things that are never directly taught. Shoulders still, breath even, tears moving sideways into the pillow. Even grief had to be managed quietly. Even grief could not be allowed to cost anyone anything. In the dark, a memory surfaced that I had not known I was still carrying. The night before the wedding, my mother had held my hands in her kitchen and said something I had not fully understood. She said, do not try to become Opal. Opal already tried that. I had heard encouragement. I had heard Opal is the standard and you should reach for it. But lying there in the dark, in a room that was not mine, in a house that was not mine, in a life that had been assigned to me with the quiet efficiency of a sentence being handed down, I began to hear something different in those words. My mother had not been holding up Opal as a model. She had been pointing at Opal as a warning. She had seen something in this house, or this family, or this woman, that she could not name directly to her 19-year-old daughter the night before her wedding. And so she had said the only thing she could find a way to say. Opal already tried that. Tried what exactly? Tried to become what? I lay there turning the question over until the sky outside began to lighten, and I did not find the answer. But the question itself was new, and new questions have a weight to them that does not go away. The fifth morning brought the shirt. Thaddeus's work shirt from 2 days prior, the one with the pocket, the one that had contained Opal's folded note. I had washed it. I had hung it on the line. I had brought it in and pressed it and folded it. And I had missed a stain near the second buttonhole. Small, pale, the kind of thing you would not see unless you were looking for it. Opal was looking for it. She came down from the main house at breakfast, which was not unusual, and she stood at the table where Thaddeus and his two brothers were eating, and she held up the shirt in both hands with the stained side facing outward. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She said, "This is not how we do things here." Thaddeus looked at the shirt. His brothers looked at the shirt. Beulah Storch, who had arrived with the morning in the easy way. She always arrived, looked at the shirt and then at me and said in that same voice, like slow sugar, "My grandmother always said that the way a woman cares for her family's clothing tells you everything about whether she values what she has been given." I said, "I am sorry, I will do better." I did not say that I had washed that shirt while barely able to stand. I did not say that I had been operating on something under 4 hours of sleep for 5 consecutive days. I did not say anything at all about any of it, because I had already learned that in this house, the space to explain yourself did not exist. The only acceptable response was an apology and a promise. Anything else was pride, and pride in our world was among the worst things a person could lay claim to. This is not the end of this story. I need you to know that. This is not going to be an hour of suffering with nothing at the end of it. But I need you to understand how deep the silence went before I can help you understand how hard it was to break it. And I need to tell you about the thing in the kitchen that I have not told you yet. There is something that almost everyone outside a community like ours misses when they try to understand what I am describing. They assume the system runs on cruelty. They imagine Opal as a villain, someone who enjoyed what she was doing, who took satisfaction in the diminishment of the women around her. That is not what I found. What I found over months and then years was something far stranger and far sadder than cruelty. Opal had stood in that same kitchen decades before me. Opal had cooked for 8 people starting before sunrise. Opal had managed the shirt stains and the laundry lines and the cold water and the shaking legs, and no one had asked if she was all right either. She had learned what I was learning, that suffering silently was the price of being considered a good wife. And she had paid that price so many times over so many years that she had stopped seeing it as a price at all. She thought she was helping me by expecting the same from me. She genuinely believed that. The whole system ran on this belief handed down from mother to daughter, generation to generation, that struggle was proof of character, and that speaking about struggle was proof of weakness. Complaining meant you thought you deserved more than what God and the community had given you. And nothing was considered more corrosive to a young wife's soul than the conviction that she deserved something different from what she had. I did not understand this yet in that 5th week, but I was beginning to feel the shape of it. And somewhere in that kitchen beneath a loose floorboard I had not yet found was the proof that Opal had once felt it too. There is a moment in most long struggles when you stop waiting for the struggle to end and start building inside of it instead. It does not arrive with any announcement. It does not feel like strength when it comes. It feels, if anything, like a very quiet decision to stop holding your breath. I made that decision somewhere in the winter of my 2nd year in that house. I cannot give you a specific date or a specific morning. What I can tell you is that by February of 1986, I had stopped measuring my days by how well I had managed the silence and started measuring them by what I had managed to say. It was not much at first. The vocabulary of a woman finding her voice inside a system built to absorb it is necessarily limited at the start. It sounded like I am not able to do that today. It sounded like I think there might be another way to approach this. It sounded like asking Thaddeus a direct question about a decision that affected me and waiting for an actual answer rather than accepting the first deflection. Small words, careful sentences. The linguistic equivalent of testing ice before you put your full weight on it. Some of those sentences landed well. Some of them did not. Thaddeus had been raised in the same architecture as Opal, and the parts of him that had shifted on that February morning outside the church were real, but they did not reach everywhere. There were evenings when he answered my questions with silence, and I had to decide whether to press or let it pass, and I did not always decide correctly. And sometimes we went to sleep with something unresolved sitting in the room between us that neither of us had the fluency to address. But I kept going. That is the part I want you to hold on to. I kept going not because I was brave or because I had arrived at some clear philosophical conviction about the value of self-expression. I kept going because Villa had told me that Opal used to fill a room with her thinking, and I had seen what had been done to that room. And I had decided in the only way I was capable of deciding things at that age, that it was not going to happen to me in the same way. Villa herself had become something important in those months. She was 16 now, and the quality of watchfulness I had noticed in her from the beginning had matured into something more deliberate. She came to help me with work on most Saturdays, and somewhere between the washing and the kitchen tasks, we had developed the habit of talking the way I imagine sisters talk, not with the performed intimacy of people trying to connect, but with the ease of two people who have simply decided to be honest with each other in a space where honesty was otherwise rationed. The seventh morning of my marriage was when Villa first cracked something open in me. We had been side by side at the washboard for perhaps 20 minutes, working in the comfortable quiet that was different from every other silence in that house, when she spoke without raising her eyes from the linen in her hands. She said, "You do not have to be like her. I mean like mother, like she is now." I did not answer right away. I needed a moment to understand what I was seeing in those words. She continued, still looking down. "She was not always this way. Aunt Helen told me once. Before she married father, she used to talk more. She had opinions about things. Aunt Helen said she could fill a room with her thinking before she ever opened her mouth." I stopped moving my hands in the water. What Villa had just handed me without knowing the full weight of what she was holding was the single most disorienting piece of information I had received since arriving in that house. Because if Opal had once been different, if she had once been a woman who filled a room with her thinking, then what I was watching her perform every day was not her nature. It was not who she was. It was something that had been done to her over years, the same thing that was now being done to me, and done with such consistency and patience and collective agreement that by the time I arrived, she had forgotten that the silence had ever been a choice. Have you ever had that experience of realizing that a pattern causing you harm was handed to you by someone who genuinely believed they were helping? That it was not malice but inheritance, not cruelty but repetition, so old it had lost its origin story? Leave a comment below if you know that feeling, because I think it is one of the most disorienting things a person can encounter, and I think it is far more common than most of us will admit. I did not say any of this to Villa. I said thank you for telling me that. And I meant it in a way that was larger than she probably understood. We finished the washing and she went back up the path to the main house, and I stood alone with my hands in the rinse water for a long time after she had gone. 3 weeks after the wedding, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, when the fields had gone to frost and the light came in low and thin through the kitchen windows, Thaddeus took his brothers out to repair a section of fence on the far side of the property, and Opal was occupied in the main house with the week's canning, and for perhaps 2 hours the small house on the path was entirely and unusually mine. I was heating water on the stove when I heard a knock at the door. A real knock, deliberate and unhurried, the kind that asks permission rather than assuming it. I cannot explain how foreign that sound felt after 3 weeks of people simply appearing in my kitchen as though the door were decorative. It was Serafina Calloway. She was dressed simply no different from how she had been at the wedding, and she carried nothing except her coat and the particular quality of presence that I had noticed in the reception line, that stillness, which was not emptiness, but rather the opposite of it, a fullness that had learned to be quiet. She said I was passing, and I thought I would ask if you had time for tea. I said yes before I had finished processing the question. We sat at the kitchen table with our cups, and for the first minute or two, neither of us spoke. Then she asked me something that no one in Harrow Creek had thought to ask, not Thaddeus, not Opal, not Reverend Whitfield, not any of the 11 relatives who had moved through the house on that first long afternoon appraising my worth. She said, "How are you doing?" Not as a question about the household. How are you actually doing? I opened my mouth to say, "I am fine, thank you." It was automatic. It was the only sentence my mouth knew how to make in response to that question after 3 weeks in that house. But something happened between the intention and the execution. My voice did not cooperate. It made a sound that was not the beginning of fine, and then it simply stopped. I sat with my mouth slightly open in the kitchen around me and the thin November light coming through the window, and I could not produce the sentence. Serafina looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded very slowly, the way you nod when someone has answered your question without speaking. She told me things then in the careful way that people share information they know will matter without making you feel lectured. She told me that she had left Harrow Creek in 1963 after 7 years of marriage to Opal's brother, that she had not been invited to a wedding or a baptism in this family in the 20 years since, and that she came back once a year anyway, because she wanted to make sure there was at least one person in every room who remembered there was another way to live. She told me this without self-pity and without performance. She was simply stating a fact about what she had chosen to do with the thing that had been done to her, and the distinction between those two things, what is done to you and what you choose to do with it, arrived in my chest like something I had needed to breathe and had not found until that moment. Before she left, she stood at the door and said something quietly that I filed away without fully understanding until much later. She said, if you find anything in that kitchen that Opal does not want you to touch, put it back where you found it and do not ask about it. But do not forget it is there. I did not know what she meant. I thanked her for coming and I watched her walk back down the path in her plain coat, and I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to. Opal came down from the main house less than an hour after Serafina left. She must have seen the path from a window. She came into the kitchen with a basket of preserves she said she was bringing to store in the cellar, which was a reasonable thing to do and also not the reason she had come. She looked at the 2 cups still on the table. She looked at me. She said, Serafina should not be distracting you from your work. I said she only stayed for a short while. Opal set the basket on the counter. The silence between her words and her next action was very precise, the kind of silence that is itself a communication. Then she said, Serafina left this community and this family. What she has to offer a young wife here is not what you need. She picked up the basket and went to the cellar door. I watched her back as she descended the steps, and I thought about something I had not consciously assembled before that moment. Opal and Serafina had a history that was older than my marriage, older than my arrival in this house, older than most of the architecture I was trying to navigate. And whatever that history contained, it had not been resolved. It lived in the 2 cups on the table, and in the precise measurement of Opal's silence, and in the careful angle of her shoulders as she went down those steps. The women in this house were not simply performing assigned roles. They were also managing something between themselves that no one was going to explain to me. I cleared the cups from the table and thought about what Serafina had said about things she did not want me to touch. 8 months after the wedding, in a June that had come in hot and bright after a cold spring, Thaddeus asked me something he had never asked before. We were in the kitchen late in the evening after his parents had gone home, and his brothers had retired to the bunkhouse and the farm had finally gone quiet. I was putting away the last of the dinner things. He was sitting at the table, not reading or working, just sitting, which was itself unusual enough that I noticed it. He said, "Are you happy here, Patience?" I set down the dish I was holding. The question landed in the room with a weight I had not anticipated. Not because it was a complicated question, but because no one had ever asked it. Not my parents when they sent me to Reverend Whitfield's pre-marriage instruction. Not the women who had come to inspect our house and our plates and our folded linens. Not Opal, not Beulah, not any of the community members who had watched me perform the role of Thaddeus Aldercott's wife for 8 months with the collective critical attention of a group of people grading a performance. No one had ever framed my happiness as something that warranted a question. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I looked at him and I told him the truth. I told him carefully because I still did not entirely trust that truth was safe in that house, but I told him as much of it as I could find words for. I said I am more tired than I have ever been in my life, and there are days when I feel like I have disappeared into something that I am not sure was ever really me. He did not say the right thing in response. I want to be honest about that. He did not have the language for it any more than I had been prepared with the language for that first morning in the dark kitchen. He sat with what I had said in a way that was not entirely comfortable, but was genuine, and that was something. And then he said, "I did not know it was like that for you." What I said was, "I know." And that single exchange, that small honest collision between two people who had been living parallel to each other for 8 months, began to change something between us. Not dramatically, not enough, but genuinely. After that night, Thaddeus began to shift in the small ways that matter more than large gestures ever do. He started a task sometimes before I asked. He said once, just once, in a voice low enough that only I could hear it, "I will do the stove tonight, go sit down." He began very gradually to look at me when I spoke in a way that was different from before, as though he were actually tracking what I was saying, rather than simply waiting for the relevant information that pertained to him. November became December, and December became the long, slow machinery of winter, and within it I was building something. Not loudly, Not in any way Reverend Whitfield would have noticed or Beulah Storch would have been able to report. But I was building it nonetheless, one small, honest sentence at a time. What I did not fully understand in those months of careful and incremental speech was that Beulah Storch had not retired from her self-appointed role as the community's monitor of my behavior. She had simply become more patient about it. I found this out at a Sunday gathering in December when Villa asked me something through the kitchen doorway, a question about the world outside Harrow Creek, of the kind that only a 15-year-old asks with genuine curiosity and complete unawareness of who is listening. I had started to answer her when Beulah appeared in the doorway. She said that is not an appropriate topic, particularly not for a girl who is not yet married. I looked at Beulah for 3 seconds longer than the situation called for. Something shifted in her expression, a recalibration. She turned and went back into the sitting room, and I returned to my work. But I understood something new she had been watching far more carefully than I had realized. I found out the full extent of it on a Sunday morning in February. Reverend Whitfield delivered his sermon that morning on the subject of order within the household. He spoke about the dangers of a wife who questions the authority of her husband. He did not use my name. He did not look at me directly. He did not need to. The room understood the reference the way a room always understands when a sermon has a specific destination. I sat in the pew with my hands in my lap and my face arranged in the expression that I had been practicing for 4 months, a kind of attentive calm that cost more to maintain than anyone watching it would have guessed. Afterward, in the slow movement of people out of the building and into the cold February air, Reverend Whitfield positioned himself near the door. He waited until Thaddeus and I were passing. He spoke to me directly. He said, "I have heard that you have been spending time with Seraphina Calloway. I want to remind you that Seraphina chose to leave God in this community and her family. That choice cost her a great deal. She is not a model for a young wife who wants to build something lasting here." I felt Thaddeus shift his weight beside me. And then from a place I had not expected, Thaddeus spoke. He said, "Thank you, Reverend. My wife and I will make our own decisions about who we spend our time with." It was one sentence. It was not a speech. It was not the defense of a hero in a story about heroes. But it was the first time in 4 months of marriage that Thaddeus Aldercott had stood beside me in a public moment and said the word "my" in connection with my decisions. Reverend Whitfield looked at him with an expression I recognized, the same one he had turned on me at the wedding, the look of a man filing something away for future reference. Opal, standing a few feet away, looked down at her hands. Beulah Storch, standing near the door with her coat already buttoned, let her mouth open slightly and then close again. We walked out into the February cold, and Thaddeus did not say anything further, and neither did I. But when we were far enough from the building that our breath was just clouds disappearing into the gray sky, I said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded once. He looked straight ahead at the path home, but his shoulders carried something different than they had carried into the church that morning, and I noticed it, and I did not forget it. A year after the wedding, in the early days of October, I was asked to clear out the storage area behind the kitchen. It was a narrow space between the back wall of the kitchen and the outer wall of the house, accessible through a low door used for the overflow of canning jars and old tools, and the accumulated patience of generations of people who could not throw anything away. I worked through it, methodically moving things to the main cellar or to the barn or out to the burn pile as appropriate. And in the far corner beneath a shelf that had partially collapsed, I found a floorboard that rocked slightly when I stepped on it. The way loose boards do, the way boards sometimes loosen over decades of the wood contracting and expanding with the seasons. I crouched down and pressed on the corner of it, and it came up with the kind of ease that told me it had been lifted before. In the space beneath, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept it clean and dry through what must have been many seasons, was a tin box. Inside the tin box was a folded piece of fabric, and inside the fabric were 2 things. The first was a set of wooden baking tools, rolling pin dough scraper, pastry mold, small, beautifully made with handles that had been worn to a shine by years of use. The same tools I had seen Opal close away so quickly in a kitchen drawer on my first morning, brushing past my question about them, as though the question itself were dangerous. The second was a notebook, brown leather cover the size of a hand. Inside, on the first page in handwriting I recognized from the household inventories and the folded notes in shirt pockets, was a date. March 12, 1961. Opal had been 21 years old in March of 1961. She had been married for approximately 7 months. I closed the notebook. I did not read further. I sat in that narrow space with the collapsed shelf above me and the cold October light coming thin through the gaps in the outer wall, and I held a closed book that belonged to someone else, and I did not open it. But I understood something in that moment that I have never stopped understanding. People do not hide things under floorboards because those things do not matter to them. People hide things under floorboards precisely because those things matter more than anything they are allowed to keep in the open. Opal had put her baking tools and her notebook in a tin box in a space beneath the floor, because somewhere in the early years of her marriage she had been required to become a person who did not need either of them anymore, and she had not been able to throw them away. I wrapped them back in the oilcloth. I replaced the tin box. I set the loose board back in place and made sure it sat level. Then I went back to the kitchen and finished the work that was waiting for me. But I thought about what Serafina had told me on that November afternoon, about things Opal did not want me to touch, about not forgetting that they were there. I thought about Villa at the washboard saying she used to fill a room with her thinking. And I thought about my mother the night before the wedding, holding my hands in her kitchen and saying something I was still only beginning to understand. Opal already tried that. She had tried to keep herself. She had tried to hold on to the parts of who she had been before the house and the role in the 30 years of mornings before sunrise. She had folded those parts up and wrapped them in oilcloth and put them in the one place in the house that was dark enough and forgotten enough to keep them safe. And she had not thrown them away. I carried that knowledge through the rest of October and into November, and I did not speak of it to anyone. But something had changed in how I moved through that house, in the quality of my attention, when I walked through the kitchen, in the way I sometimes stood at the stove, with my hand resting on the edge of the counter. Not because I needed to hold myself up anymore, but because I was thinking about what was beneath the floor and what it meant that it was there. And I was beginning very slowly to think about what I was going to do with what I now knew. There is a moment in most long struggles when you stop waiting for the struggle to end and start building inside of it instead. I had already found that moment, but what came next required something different. It required the willingness to let what I had built be seen. What I did not fully understand in those Saturday conversations over the washing and the bread dough was that Beulah Storch had not retired from her self-appointed role as the community's monitor of my behavior. She had simply become more patient about it. I found out the full extent on a Saturday afternoon in March of my second year, when Beulah arrived at my kitchen door without the usual covering pretense of borrowed butter or excess preserves. She came in and she sat down at the table and she told me directly what she had come to say. She said, "You are going to ruin that girl." I said, "I am sorry." She said, "Villa, you are filling her head with ideas that are going to make it impossible for her to build a life here. She is at the age when she needs to be learning how to become a wife, not learning how to question everything she has been given. What you are doing to her is selfish. You are using her to say the things you know you cannot say yourself." I stood at the counter for a long moment with my hands flat on the surface and the afternoon light coming through the window, and Beulah Storch sitting at my kitchen table with her coat still on, waiting. And then something happened that I had not planned and had not practiced. I turned around and I looked at her. Not the way I had looked at her in December, with a few extra seconds of eye contact before looking away. I looked at her the way you look at someone when you have finally stopped being afraid of what your looking might cost you. I said, "Mrs. Storch, I have been answering Villa's questions honestly because she deserves honest answers. The same answers that you and I deserved when we were her age and did not receive." The kitchen was very quiet. Beulah looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not anger. I had expected anger, and I had prepared for it, and it would have been easier than what actually arrived on her face. What arrived was something much older than anger. It was the expression of a person who has organized a great deal of their life around a particular belief and has just encountered something that creates a small fault line in that belief, and who is deciding in real time whether to look at the fault line or to walk away from it. She chose to walk away from it. She stood up and buttoned her coat, which was already buttoned, and she said, "You will understand when you have been here longer." And she left. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed, and I waited to feel the old familiar consequence, the contracting guilt, the inventory of what I should have said differently. And I waited. And it did not come, not in the shape I expected. What came instead was something quieter and less dramatic and much more solid. I had said the true thing. The world had not ended. Beulah Storch stopped coming to my kitchen alone after that afternoon. She continued to appear at community gatherings, and she continued to carry herself with the particular authority of a woman who has decided that her role is to guard something, and I continued to be polite to her because she was not the enemy I had once understood her to be. She was something sadder than an enemy. She was a person who had absorbed the system so completely that protecting it had become identical to protecting herself. That understanding did not make things easier between us, but it changed the quality of my feelings about her, and that change made more room for other things. Opal got sick in the winter of my third year in the house. It began as what everyone assumed was a seasonal illness, the kind of chest cold that moved through farming communities every winter, but it did not resolve the way those illnesses usually did. By February, she was spending mornings in her room, which was something none of us had ever seen Opal do. By March, she was not coming down to the main house kitchen before noon. Thaddeus and his brothers managed the farm work without adjustment because that was what men in that community did when something went wrong. They continued. They did not alter the external pattern of their days because altering the pattern would have meant acknowledging that something had fundamentally changed. So I went up the path to the main house. I went every morning and most afternoons. I brought food and I sat with Opal while she ate it, and I managed the main house kitchen so that it continued to run the way it was expected to run. And I did this not because anyone asked me to, and not because I believed it was my assigned role, but because Opal was sick and she was there, and I was capable of helping, and those three facts together seemed sufficient. The first several days we did not speak much. She was not well enough for sustained conversation, and there was also the history between us. The weight of 3 years of assessments and corrections, and the particular silence of two women who had been living in proximity to each other without ever quite meeting. Then one afternoon in late March, when the light outside had finally started to carry a little warmth again, and Opal was sitting up in her chair by the window, with a blanket across her knees, she said something that I had not expected and was not prepared for. She said, "Do you hate me, Patience?" I looked at her. She was looking out the window. She had asked the question in the same tone she used for practical matters, but the question itself was not a practical matter, and she knew it and I knew it. And the gap between those two things was something we both sat with for a moment. I said no, but there are things that were normal in this house that I had to decide not to accept. And that was hard. She did not respond right away. Outside the window, the fields were still brown from the winter, and the sky was that particular pale blue that comes before the real warmth returns. She said very quietly, "I know." And then she said something else. She said, "I used to make bread on Tuesdays. Real bread, not the quick kind, with the wooden tools that were my mother-in-law's. It took most of the morning. Harold said it took too long and I should use the simpler method instead. So I did." She stopped there. She did not need to elaborate because I knew what she was not saying. I knew because I had held the wooden tools in my hands and felt the wear on the handles where her grip had shaped them, and I had put them back in the tin box, and I had not told her that I had found them. I said, "The tools your mother-in-law gave you, the ones with the worn handles." She turned her head and looked at me for the first time during that conversation. She said, "You found them." I said, "A year ago, I put them back." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back out the window. She said, "I know you did." I checked. We sat with that for a while. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Opal's breathing was steady but effortful, the way breathing sounds when the lungs are working harder than they should. Then she said, "And this is the sentence I have carried for the rest of my life. I put them there because I could not throw them away, and I could not keep them where anyone could see them and ask me why I still had things I did not use anymore." I understood then, with the kind of understanding that arrives in the chest before it arrives in the mind, what the tin box had actually contained. Not just baking tools and a notebook. Not just the artifacts of a woman who had once made bread on Tuesdays. It was the place where Opal had put the parts of herself she had not been permitted to keep in the open. The thoughts and the preferences and the version of herself that had existed before the house and the role had reshaped her into someone else. She had not destroyed those parts. She had hidden them in the one place dark enough to keep them safe. And she had spent 30 years going down to check that they were still there. Opal died in May of that year. It was a Sunday morning, quiet and early, with the light just beginning to come through the curtains of her room. Thaddeus was there. His brothers were there. I was there. There is a particular kind of grief that is not simple, that carries within it the weight of everything that was not said between two people during the time they had, and that is the grief I carried out of that room. Not uncomplicated sorrow. Something more like the recognition that we had arrived near the end at something real, and that the real thing between us had come too late to build very much on, but had come in time to matter. I helped with the preparations that followed. I made the food. I managed the house. I did the things that needed doing in the particular numb competence that arrives after a loss when the body keeps working because the mind has not yet fully registered what has changed. It was Villa who brought me the envelope. She found it 3 days after Opal died while she was helping air out her mother's room. It was beneath the pillow, small and white, and it had my name on it in Opal's handwriting. Villa handed it to me without expression, which was itself a kind of respect, and I took it outside and sat on the step of the small house and opened it. Inside were two things. The first was a slip of paper, and the handwriting on it was more unsteady than the household inventories, and the notes in shirt pockets and the date at the top of the notebook page. It said, "I knew you found the box. I left the board loose on purpose. Thank you for putting it back without asking me about it." I read those two sentences 3 times. I had assumed for a year that finding the loose board had been an accident. I had assumed that Opal did not know I had been there. I had understood my decision to replace the tin box and say nothing as a private choice, something I had done and held quietly by myself. But Opal had left that board loose deliberately. She had been waiting to see what I would do when I found what she had hidden. And my choice to put it back without asking, without using what I had found to change the balance of power between us, was the thing she had been waiting to see. She had been testing me, not the way she had tested my bread and my laundry and my fire starting. She had been testing something that had no name in Harrow Creek's vocabulary, something closer to trustworthiness, closer to the specific kind of care that knows when not to speak. The second thing in the envelope was the notebook. On the inside cover in fresher ink than the entries Opal had written, "Now you can read it. You have earned the right to know who I was before I became who I had to be." I sat on the step in the May morning with the notebook in my hands, and I did not open it immediately. I held it, and I thought about the woman who had stood in my kitchen doorway every morning for 3 years, with an expression that I had read as judgment, and that had been in some part I had not been able to see something else as well. An accounting, a measuring of whether I would survive it or be swallowed by it the way she had been. Then I opened it. The first entry was dated March 12th, 1961. Opal had been 21 years old. She had been married for 7 months, and she had written in the careful handwriting of someone who had been taught to form her letters precisely. "I stood in the kitchen this morning before sunrise, and my legs were shaking, and I did not know where the flour was kept, and I did not ask because asking would have meant admitting that I did not know, and I did not know if that was allowed yet. No one asked if I was all right. I wonder if this is what it is supposed to feel like. I wonder if I am the only one who feels this way." I sat on the step with the notebook in my hands and the May light around me, and I did not try to stop the tears this time. I let them come the way they needed to come, without managing them, without keeping my shoulders still, or my breath even, because I was not in that house anymore, in the way I had once been, and there was no one whose rest I needed to protect. Opal Aldercott had stood in that kitchen in 1961, with shaking legs and no flour, and no one asking if she was all right. I had stood in the same kitchen in 1984, 23 years later, in exactly the same posture, with exactly the same silence around me. She had not broken the pattern, but she had written it down. She had put the record of it in a tin box under the floor, and she had spent 3 decades checking that it was still there. And when I arrived in her kitchen, she had eventually, in the only way available to her, handed it to me. I read the notebook over the course of 3 days in the early mornings before the house woke, and in the late evenings after it went quiet. What was there was precise and honest in the way that things written for no audience tend to be honest the way people tell the truth when they believe no one is listening. She had written about learning to make bread with the wooden tools her mother-in-law had given her, how the weight of the dough and the rhythm of the work had felt like the one part of the household labor that was genuinely hers, that carried something of her own making in it. She had written about the morning Harold told her the bread took too long. She had written, "I put the tools away. I did not argue. I wonder sometimes what it would have been like to argue." That sentence stayed with me. I wonder sometimes what it would have been like to argue. She had never found out. She had put the tools away, and she had made the simpler bread, and 30 years had passed, and the tools had gone into the tin box, and the tin box had gone under the floor. And she had raised a son who did not think to ask his wife if she was all right when she nearly fell in the kitchen. Not because he was a bad man, but because he had learned from the evidence of his entire life that certain things were managed quietly and alone. Understanding that did not erase the grief of it, but it shifted where the grief was aimed. I went to see Reverend Whitfield one morning in June, 2 weeks after Opal died. I had not planned the visit. I was passing the church on an errand, and I saw his car in the lot, and I stopped and went inside. He was at his desk in the small office behind the sanctuary. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and his expression arranged itself into the warm and certain look he used for pastoral visits. He said, "Patience, come in." I sat in the chair across from his desk, and I said what I had come to say without any particular drama. I said, "Opal left me her notebook. I have been reading it. I wanted you to know that I understand now why she was the way she was, and I wanted you to know that I am not going to be the way she was." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "What does that mean exactly?" I said it means I'm going to keep talking. To Villa. To whoever asks me something and deserves an honest answer. I am going to keep asking questions when I have them. I am not going to fold myself up and put myself in a box under the floor in order to make it easier for this community to decide who I am. He leaned back in his chair. He said Opal was a woman of great dignity and great faith. I said she was, and she spent 30 years of her life in a house where no one asked if she was all right. I do not think those two things are unconnected. Reverend Whitfield looked at me with the expression I had first seen at my wedding, the one that filed things away for future reference. But there was something different in it this time. It was the expression of a man who has encountered an argument he cannot immediately answer and has decided that the most strategic response is silence. He did not say anything further that was useful. I thanked him for his time and I left. Walking back down the road toward the small house on the Aldercott property, I thought about what I had just done, and I waited for the familiar weight of consequence to settle on my shoulders. And it was there, I will not pretend otherwise. The old machinery of that community did not simply stop because I had decided to step out of it. But the weight felt different from how it had felt before. It felt like something I had chosen rather than something that had been placed on me without my consent. That distinction between what you carry because you have chosen it and what you carry because no one gave you a choice is one of the most important distinctions I know. Villa left Harrow Creek in the spring of 1988. She was 19. She did not leave dramatically. She did not leave with an announcement or a confrontation or a door slammed behind her. She simply told her father one morning that she was going to stay with a family she had connected with through a correspondence people outside the community. And she packed what she needed and she hugged me in my kitchen with her arms around my neck the way she had never done before. And she walked down the path and got into the car that was waiting for her. I watched her go and I thought about the morning at the washboard, the low voice and the eyes fixed on the work in her hands, the sentence that had cracked something open in me that had been sealed without my knowing it. She had given me that without knowing what she was giving me, and I had been handing her things in return, honest answers and permission. She had not been offered anywhere else, and we had built something between us that had no name in Harrow Creek, but that felt, from where I stood watching her car move down the dirt road, very much like the kind of friendship that changes the shape of a life. I stayed for 3 more years after Villa left. That time is its own story, and I'm not going to tell all of it now. What I will tell you is that Thaddeus and I tried in the specific and effortful way of two people who have both changed, but not in directions that converge, and that by the spring of 1989 we had arrived together and without drama at the understanding that trying was not going to be sufficient. He was not a villain. I want to say that clearly because it is true, and because the truth of it matters to the whole shape of what I'm telling you. He was a man who had been handed a blueprint and had built according to it, and the building he had made was solid and real, and entirely unable to contain the person I had become. That is a tragedy of a specific and quiet kind, and I have had a long time to understand it, and I do not carry it as bitterness anymore. I left Harrow Creek in April of 1989. I was 24 years old. I took 2 bags in the tin box because Opal had given it to me, and the tools inside it were mine now, worn handles and all. Serafina Calloway was waiting at the end of the road. I had called her from the community phone, the one near the feed store that was technically available to anyone and practically used by very few. She had answered on the second ring. I had said, "I think it is time." She had said, "I know. Tell me when and where." She was standing beside her car in the April morning, dressed plainly, her bright dark eyes steady and without performance of any kind. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not say, "I have been waiting." She did not make the moment into anything larger than what it was. She said, "Do you want to drive or shall I?" I said, "You drive. I would like to just sit for a while." We drove for about an hour before either of us said much of anything. The Lancaster County countryside moved past the windows, the fields just beginning to green up after the winter, and I sat in the passenger seat with the tin box on my lap and I let the distance accumulate between me and the small house on the Aldercott property without trying to manage what I felt about it. Then Serafina said without taking her eyes off the road, Opal was a good woman. I said I know she was. Serafina said she was also a woman who ran out of road before she found her way out. Not everyone makes it. She made sure you did. I looked out the window at the fields going past. I thought about what Opal had written from her sickbed, knowing I would read it, knowing I had already proven myself by putting the box back without asking. She had been watching me from the first morning I appeared in her kitchen, assessing not the bread quality, or the shirt stains, or the fire-starting abilities, but the deeper question of whether I was going to survive or disappear. And when she understood what I was made of, she had handed me the record of what she had been before the house had finished its work on her. I carried the wooden tools and the notebook out of that community the way you carry something that does not belong to you and also belongs entirely to you. Both things at once without contradiction. I am standing in my kitchen now. The coffee is still hot. The window still looks out onto a yard where nothing is required of me before the sun comes up. My hands are steady around the mug, and they have been steady for a long time. On the shelf above the counter, where I can see it from almost anywhere in this kitchen, the wooden tools are arranged in the order Opal's mother-in-law must have arranged them. Rolling pin on the left, dough scraper in the middle, pastry mold on the right. I use them on Tuesday mornings. The handles fit my hands the way they must have fit Opal's hands and Opal's hands before mine, and whoever's hands originally shaped the wood to that particular warmth. The notebook is in a drawer in my desk in the room I think of as mine, in the way that nothing in the Aldercott house was ever mine. I have read it many times. Each time I find something I had not noticed before, which is the nature of documents written by people who were telling the truth to no audience and therefore hid nothing. I want to say something directly to you now before we close. If you are watching this and you are carrying something that you have been told is not worth carrying, if you have been living in a house of any kind, a literal one, or the kind built from expectation and silence and the accumulated weight of other people's needs, if there is a version of yourself that you have put in a tin box and hidden somewhere dark because no one around you had space for it in the open, I want you to know something. Opal never threw the box away. Through 30 years of the kind of life that wears a person down so gradually, they stopped noticing the wearing she held onto it. She checked on it. She kept it whole. And when someone arrived who she believed was capable of understanding what it meant, she left the board loose. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The question I want to leave you with is not complicated. It is just honest. Is there a version of yourself that you have put somewhere dark because the life you are living does not have room for it in the open? And if there is there someone in your life, or perhaps someone watching this right now, who would understand what it means if you left the board a little loose? You do not have to answer that out loud, but I hope you answer it honestly wherever you answer it. I started with shaking legs in a kitchen I did not know, and a week in which no one asked if I was all right. I am ending here in my own kitchen with steady hands and the wooden tools on the shelf and a notebook in my desk that a woman I once believed was my adversary left me as the most honest gift she had to give. That journey took years. It was not clean or simple or free of loss. I left things behind that mattered to me, and I grieve some of them still. But I am here. I made it, and the tools are on the shelf where anyone can see them. If this story reached something in you, please share it with someone you think might need to hear it. And if there is a board in your life that is a little loose, I hope you have the courage to look underneath it.